Look, we've been talking about this counteroffensive for some time, and I've just made it clear that there's not anything NATO can do to help Ukraine and create a potential for a viable counteroffensive. The Russians are defending doctrinally. They have sufficient resources to the task, and we're seeing the evidence of this as the Ukrainians, they've committed their best brigade. I think the 47th Brigade, the one armed with the modern Leopards and the Bradleys. This is NATO equipment, the NATO artillery, NATO planning, NATO intelligence, NATO everything except the manpower. And they're being slaughtered, butchered. And that's what's going to happen to every aspect of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. This is mass murder, not by the Russians, but by those who have pushed the Ukrainians to carry out this operation, despite everybody knowing it would fail. Everybody. There's not a person on the earth that actually believes that actually believes. I mean, I'm not talking about the propaganda statements. I'm talking about an honest to God expert who says, no, I really think the Ukrainians can win this. There's not a military expert, because if you believe it, you're not an expert in the military art. The Ukrainians don't have the tactics. They don't have the operational capacity to penetrate a Russian defensive barrier that is manned to this level in doctrinal fashion. The Russians have overwhelming firepower, supremacy, not superiority, supremacy. The Ukrainians aren't even giving out the starting block. They can't, they on some occasions they get their claws into the first line of the defense, which is okay. It's what the Russians want. You see, the Russians aren't in the business of losing men. They'll slaughter them as they come in. They'll pull back to a secondary position, slaughter them there, and then they push them back. The Ukrainians are making zero headway. They're all going to die. I've said this from the start, and I think the evidence is there. The Ukrainians, every single person that they commit to this counteroffensive will be dead, wounded, prisoner, or suffering from PTSD from the trauma that they're going to experience. This is mass murder, and anybody who supports this is somebody who should be charged as is a party to the crime. Do I think Poland is stupid enough to go into Ukraine? Look, the Poles are pretty stupid, but all of NATO has to watch. The Polish government, I should say, is pretty stupid. Elements of the Polish government. But NATO has to understand, and again, I'll just say this straight up, to all you Poles out there who think that your army is something else, let me tell you right now that the Ukrainian army, if they pivoted and headed west, would roll over your army like a hot knife through butter, because you can't fight. You don't know how to fight. You're not prepared to fight. You haven't trained to fight. Nobody in NATO has. NATO cannot do what's happening on the ground right now in Ukraine. NATO is incapable of fielding multi-brigades carrying out this kind of concerted offensive action. The Ukrainians are. They have a capable army, but they're going up against the world's best army. And that is the Russian army, especially when defending doctrinally. There's not a military in the world that can crack the Russian defense right now. And the Russians are going to destroy the Ukrainians. And anybody in NATO who thinks, well, we could do better with our troops. No, you couldn't. The Germans couldn't even get out of the barracks. The French can't get out of the barracks. The Americans don't have enough troops. It's just, this is a fact. And what we've seen is the Ukrainians have been given this NATO equipment, and they are literally dying. And this is what happens. There is no magic weapon. NATO equipment isn't that good. It's really not. And their doctrine, their tactics, their operational theories, not that good either, because they haven't been doing this. NATO's been playing stupid games in Afghanistan. NATO's been playing regime change in Libya. NATO's been playing back up the United States in Iraq and Syria. The one thing NATO hasn't been doing is backing up the rhetoric of Jan Stoltenberg and other NATO talking heads with reality. This is why General Cavoli, the commander of all allied forces last January, said something very honest, that the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine, and this was pre-counteroffensive, this is the stuff that was happening in the fall, it was beyond the imagination of NATO. Nobody in NATO imagined violence of this scale. NATO was not trained, equipped, prepared, incapable of doing this kind of fighting. And that's a fact. So anybody who sits there and says, well, NATO's going to come in with what? I challenge you to tell me what the order of battle will be. What will the NATO order of battle will be? And I'll tell you what it is. Nothing. Maybe some Polish troops, but the Polish troops are incapable of offensive operations. Once Poland tries to send a division plus size element into Western Ukraine, they will bog down logistically because Poland's not prepared to support this. And this is before Russia starts blowing them to hell. Russia controls the airspace. A military aspect that has been ignored by the West, or at least they've turned a blind eye to it, is the masterful way in which General Surovikin has dismantled the Ukrainian air defense systems. You know, the ones that we've been propping up with the Patriots, they're all gone. The Iris, they're gone. The NASAMS, they're gone too. Nothing works. The Russians have figured it out. They have adapted, and they've come in and they dismantled it. There is no viable air defense on the front lines now, which means as the Ukrainians come forward, it is literally a turkey shoot by the Russians. Their helicopters are picking off the Ukrainian tanks. Their aircraft are coming in and dropping the glide bombs on troop concentrations. This is mass murder, and the Russians haven't even begun the flex yet. So this is a sad day because this is not something that anybody should gloat about. This is needless slaughter of men, and yeah, NATO can't fight as they're too cowards. Well, I'll tell you what. I don't mean to pick on Mr. Point Man. American troops aren't cowards. So guess what? You're wrong. And I'll tell you what, the British troops aren't cowards either. I've served with them. I don't think the French are cowards either. All right, so be careful when you throw around the term coward. They actually took an oath and they are serving in uniform right now. The problem isn't their bravery. The problem is they haven't been preparing for this kind of conflict. But the last thing I would say is that NATO soldiers are cowards. First of all, they're in the military. Okay, cowards don't gravitate towards the military. Cowards don't gravitate towards jobs that involve close quarter combat and getting killed. So I would never call NATO cowards. I would call NATO political leadership cowards. And this is why. And I've said this about Lindsey Graham. If you sit there and say that you want to fight to the last Ukrainian, then you're a piece of dirt. And you are a coward personified. If you want a war with Russia, if you really want the war with Russia, and I'm someone who advocates against it, then by God, put your blood and guts on the line. I'm not talking about Lindsey Graham. He's an old man, fat man. He doesn't know how to fight. But he's an American senator. Hey, Lindsey, why don't you ask for a declaration of war? Why don't you ask for the President of the United States to authorize American troops to cross into Ukraine to fight the Russians, the ones you want to kill? Why don't you do that, Lindsey? That's what a man would do. A man would say, let's take on the Russians. Let's do this, the old school. Let's go old fashioned. But Lindsey's not a man. He's a mouse. And he's letting the Ukrainians get slaughtered on behalf of his warped perspective on the world. And that's the most cowardly thing in the world, to let Ukrainian men, and I'm going to call them men, people need to understand how much courage it takes. I mean, these guys know that they're going into the buzzsaw. They know what's getting ready to happen, and they're doing it. Okay, I can tell you their hearts are in their throats, their stomachs are churning, everything, but they're doing it. They're getting in their vehicles, they are running those engines, and they are advancing towards the enemy. And that takes cojones the size of bowling balls. So don't call the Ukrainians cowards. They're not. I challenge anybody out there who calls them coward. You go do it. You go do it. You're not. And NATO's not. Not because the troops are cowards. They would obey their orders if they were given the orders. It's because the leadership are cowards. Despicable leadership, cowardly leadership, letting other people do the fighting for them. It's disgusting.
Given that Russia expected how do you pronounce that exactly, Scott?
Kakhovka.
What?
Kakhovka
Dam to be breached. And as Russia was in control of the area, could they not have prevented this by fortifying and actively monitoring it? This may be a naive question, as I am not a war expert. So you can't bite this person's head off because they already admitted they're naive.
No. First of all, it's not a war expert. It's an engineering question. The reservoir was full. It was damaged by the Ukrainians. We know the Ukrainians damaged it. The Russians did not damage it. Russia sought to secure this dam early on because it's a strategic target. Russia had been talking about the Ukrainian threat to this dam from day one. Back in October of last year, Russia published a letter to the Security Council saying, hey, the Ukrainians are going to try and take this dam out, and it's going to cause an ecological disaster. We need to we need to call Ukraine out on this and anybody who supports them. Of course, the British and the Americans and the French on the Permanent Five, they ignored this letter. In December, a Ukrainian general talking about the fall activity said, yeah, we were looking at if things went bad, we were going to blow the dam. That was going to be a last resort. We were going to blow the dam up. We actually fired a HIMARS system to try and target the valves. We saw that we could. We hit a valve. We saw we did damage. So we know it was a success. And we know that we could do this. But we opted not to do it at this time. But we know that the Ukrainians practice blowing up the dam as a measure of last resort. And as soon as this counteroffensive started, it was clear to the Ukrainian command that they aren't going to win. That this is the end. So they blew the dam. Now, did they blow it directly? Was this an accumulation of damage? Some analysis has to be done on what exactly triggered it. But from a civil engineering standpoint, when you have a damaged dam and you have a full reservoir, you can't drain the reservoir, and you have to be careful about opening it up because the valves are damaged. If you let too much water through, you start to compromise the integrity of the valves. Compounding this is the fact that the Ukrainians themselves started dumping water into the reservoir a couple days before this thing failed. They were creating an even greater threat. So there is no question that the Ukrainians were behind this, that they wanted this to happen. And they're the ones to be held responsible. No way Russia, and there was nothing Russia could do because the Ukrainians were actively shelling this dam on a continuous basis. You can't ask civil engineers to come in and do a civil engineering project under fire. First of all, the dam's going to be blown. Now, the Russians did everything. If you remember, General Surovikin back in the fall, he talked about this. He said, one of the reasons why we're not staying on the right bank of Dnieper River in Kherson is because if they blow this dam, 30,000 Russian troops will be isolated and slaughtered. And it's a problem. So they withdrew the Russian troops, and they withdrew somewhere around 22,000 civilians from that area and got them out of harm's way, anticipating that the Ukrainians would blow this. But this is something that the Russians have been anticipating for some time now. But there's nothing you can do to stop it. If the Ukrainians wanted to take that out, I mean, the Russians put air defense systems in, but you can't get them all. And eventually, one was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. It was the one that caused the valves to fail. The system failed, and now the dam is ruptured. The Ukrainian government did this, and because they're using Western weapons, in this case, an American weapon, the Americans are responsible. I'm not saying that Joe Biden said blow the dam. What I'm saying is Joe Biden didn't say don't blow the dam. The United States easily could have picked up the phone call and said, hey, Zelensky, we got a couple $1 billion worth of equipment here that we're going to start rolling India. If that dam blows, you're never going to see it. We're pulling the plug. You're going to die. We don't care about you because we don't support eco-terrorists, except we are eco-terrorists because we blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And a lot of people aren't talking about it, but there's a Togliatti ammonia pipeline that, it transfers ammonia to European markets to be converted into fertilizer, and the Ukrainians blew that up too. Whoever was responsible for that isn't just a terrorist, but is pretty damn stupid because they blew it up when the prevailing wind was pointing to the Ukrainian lines. So this giant ammonia cloud drifted to the Ukrainian lines, killed some Ukrainian soldiers, and forced others to evacuate their positions. But it's eco-terrorism. The Ukrainians don't care about anything. The Ukrainian government is a criminal government that will do anything it can to create problems for Russia. Look at Kherson. One of the reasons why they blew this dam is now you have literally created an infrastructure nightmare. Russia is going to win this conflict, win this war. Kherson is Russia and will be occupied by Russia in totality. Who knows? Maybe Nikolaev will be as well. Maybe Odessa will be as well. Who knows how this is going to end? Only Putin and the high command know. But one thing is certain. All of Kherson will be under Russian control. But now the Russians have a multi-$100 billion infrastructure problem. They've got to fix the dam, and then they've got to fix all of the damage that has been done because of this flooding, and the damage is considerable. People aren't even talking about what's been done to the Black Sea. You know, there's vacationers on the beach right now watching homes float out into the ocean. All the pollution that came down, all the mines that were swept away are now floating in the Black Sea. So eventually there will be mines floating up on the beach in Georgia, in Russia, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and innocent civilians are going to die. This is what terrorists do, and this is what the Ukrainians have done. And the world needs to call them out. This is a disgusting, despicable regime. We knew it. I mean, what do you expect from people who support Stepan Bandera, who make them make him their national hero, who sing songs in the praise of a man who slaughtered tens of thousands of Jews, 110,000 Poles, 200,000+ Russians? He's a criminal mastermind, and we have a government that glorifies him. So of course they're going to do things that replicate the kind of mentality that's behind this odious ideology.
Odious.